Hello everyone, Bag here. Cipher is our second half unit coming in 3.2. So if you're wondering how to fit her onto your account, then this is the video for you. Before we get into this tier list proper, let's first get into what she provides as a support overall. Cipher has three main aspects to her kit that gives her a leg in this extremely competitive support meta that she finds herself in. She has a constant 40% vulnerability debuff, she stores and then redishes out proportional true damage that's either 24% for a primary marked enemy or 16% for everyone else, and she has semi-respectable personal damage for her support, thanks in part to her okay scaling on her skill and semi-frequent follow-up attack. In this, the realm that she primarily competes in is in that generalized gives big numbers rather than actual utility category, which so far has been filled by Jiaoshu, Ranmei, and Pela, so long as those first two aren't in their actual respective niches. As one of the top dogs in this category, Cipher is now more directly comparable to the other new top dog, that being the first iteration of the newly buffed Silverwolf. When comparing them, Cipher has an advantage in AoE scenarios, since even after the buff, Silverwolf's skill is still stuck to being single target, while Silverwolf works better with a team that already has defense shred, as the massive defense shred that she contributes can lead to the team's defense shred overall being more impactful than Cipher's equivalent vulnerability. So Cipher isn't always 100% the best in this niche, but she is still again a top dog in it for literally every team in the game. What she clearly lacks over other meta supports are the many trademarks of Harmony units: action advancing, energy funneling, and the ability to hold DDD, which yes, I'm counting as a separate stacking variable on top of built-in action advancing. While her damage damping is quite potent, most carries can more easily make use of more general supporting options that are synergistic with their respective game plans. Tribbie has constant AoE attacks and DDD spamming potential, Sunday gives energy and potentially doubles your turns, Robin gives multiple team-wide action advances. These are all very general utilities that are widely applicable to what a carry would want from their supports. Where Cipher is notable is when her niches directly contribute to a certain carry's respective game plan in her own unique way. And as you might be able to guess, that is less universal than a good old S5 DDD. This is all to say, Cipher is an incredibly universal unit whose broader uses on your account will be determined by how decked out you already are with premium supports. As we get into the tier list itself, this list might take a bit of a different, more negative approach when discussing units placements. As I just established, that while her baseline is great, here it's more so a question of if she does anything unique against her competition to set herself apart. Let's, for example, look at Castorice and the Herta. These are units who, very much so, enjoy Cipher's AoE debuffs and proportional true damage. One strength with Cipher is that she can take damage that is otherwise wasted on health bars that you don't care about, where she instead redistributes it into the primary boss that is the linchpin of the fight's clear speed. This strength is not strictly applicable to, say, pure fiction clears, since the always present adjacent enemies means that the quote shared damage with Cipher's ultimate will be partially wasted on less impactful HP bars, but even then, it is still a proper tool to reallocate those AoE damage dealer's hits into more focused bursts of damage. But then we bring into competition like RMC. RMC's action advance is huge for both Castorice and the Herta, since their respective energy mechanics are the primary way that they further their game plans. You can't just say Cipher provides X% more damage over her direct competition, when that competition provides the actual utility that allows for lower cycle clears for these carries. While she can generate 9 energy for the Herta with her follow-ups, and follow-ups are nice to have for Castorice when paired with Luocha, Gallagher, or E1 Hyacine's per hit healing, she is just behind in these factors compared to Mem's, RMC's, and especially Tribbie's AoE hits, where then Tribbie also has DDD for that extra turn giving utility. So for either of them, I would not recommend getting Cipher over, say, Hyacine, who's in the same patch, as upgrades for either of them. But in isolation, she can get the job done, kind of, if your team building across your two teams really requires it. This line of thinking also goes for other AoE carries, like Argenti, Mini Herta, or Jade, where not only are Tribbie or Robin generally preferable for their extra turns, but Sunday is also competitive for each of these carries' respective energy needs. Of course, another factor here that I don't want to ignore is that these are 3 limited supports that not everyone has. So I am not going to sit here and write off Cipher as being unviable for being marginally worse than these units that not everyone has or will ever get. But if your main goal is to build your favorite carries' respective best teams, then Cipher will fall a bit to the wayside in standard comps with these units. To go over some other units who really appreciates RMC's support, Mydei fits that bill to a T. Although I do want to mention here that with him, Castorice, Blade, and soon Jingliu, that Cipher has by nature less competition for directly buffing them thanks to their HP scaling nature. Aglaea is, at base, a super needy carry that really loses out on her momentum when losing one of Sunday Sunday, RMC, Bronya, or Robin. But if you already have enough support power given to her to make her rotation work, either with her E1 or more importantly in a sustainless team, then Cipher can be a very good last piece of that puzzle in making sure that Aglaea's many turns are properly buffed. Overall, not bad, but for a typical 2 support team comp, then yeah, she's kinda eh. To round out this so far monolithic tier list, let's look at units who are above and below the current single tier that we've filled thus far. Feixiao is a unit that checks that box of getting something uniquely good from Cipher's support, thanks to her follow-up attack that she gets once per turn. She gets put a good bit behind Hunt March in terms of stack generation, as March also has 1 follow-up per turn, but also a much more spammable ultimate and a pretty frequent 100% action advance. Still, while March gives 60 crit damage, Cipher gives 40% vulnerability and 24% true damage, thanks to Feixiao being 100% single target, so it's an overall win for her in the end. This can also be compared to the 40 crit damage and 25% follow-up attack vulnerability from an E2 plus Mydei, although his attack frequency is a lot more difficult to directly compare since it's in part tied to the rest of the team's frequency of attacks. Finally, Topaz gives a very comparable 50% follow-up attack vulnerability debuff at E0S0, which is less than the complete package of Cipher, especially if she runs Pearls, but Topaz with Numbi still does give overall a bit more stacks. Topaz, like Mydei, is pretty variable with how many stacks Numbi can give, based on how many follow-up attacks from the rest of the team push forward Numbi's action value. In this context, that's usually in the form of eventual range follow-up attacks, which then, yes, means that Topaz's rate of stack generation is pretty fight dependent. But if you want me to generalize, then with Cipher, you should expect to see 1 to maybe 2 less Feixiao ults with Cipher over the course of the fight, with that deficit increasing the longer the fight goes. But clears should still be generally faster thanks to the higher damage per ult. Think about it like this: every 4 ults from Feixiao will result in 1 Feixiao ult worth of damage being recorded by Cipher, with this obviously not counting all of the team's damage besides Feixiao's ult also being recorded. So again, less ults, more damage, overall faster clears. My TLDR recommendation is that if you already have a Topaz for your Feixiao, Cipher is an improvement, but maybe one that's not worth gunning for over something like an E1 Robin instead. This is also even more true if you're one of the like bajillion people with an S1 Topaz, as while an E0 S1 Cipher does beat an E0 S1 Topaz, that's 2 levels of investment for a marginal upgrade, which I wouldn't call worth. Generally though, Cipher is Feixiao's best teammate in the sub DPS role, so while March and E2 plus Mydei are very good at what they give her, if you are looking for an upgrade in this team slot specifically, then Cipher is the best option to go for in that regard. It is worth noting, lastly, that E2 plus Feixiao actually prefers Topaz over Cipher, since the extra synergy with follow-up attacks favors Numbi's stack generation slightly more. On the other end of this tier list, someone like Clara, Jingliu, Anaxa, Qingxue, Dill, or Sile usually again want something more specific from their team on top of just damage, usually in the form of energy, turns, and SP. Like, the extra damage amping from Cipher does make it a lot easier for Sile to proc her resurgences, but something like an extra mem turn or edging out the cycle with DDD can then lead to multiple extra turns thanks to her resurgences and action advancing basics. This same point has been made like 10 times in this video already, which is partially why I'm grouping all of these units together. I think you get the idea. One unit who is in that ever so lovely it depends territory is none other than Yunli. On paper, her countering playstyle makes action advancing less important, and while energy is as important as ever for her to get those important counters, and she does get extra energy from Sunday due to her high max energy, this energy need can be met by the enemy comp. If she's against someone like Hule, and the factor that determines her clear speed is not her energy, but instead the actual damage that comes from her follow-ups, then Cipher can be a best in slot option. But if it's instead a normal fight, where she only has a few pivotal counters to get off per cycle, and she needs proper energy support to get those counters out, then Sunday's energy and Robin's and Tribbie's extra turns become more important. I could see putting her in the top tier, but right now I'll settle for keeping her at the very top of this secondary placing. A plug here to subscribe. After the Cipher guide, which is next up, we are full swing into the 3.4 content cycle, with Saber, Archer, Phainon, and a re-examination of the newly buffed units. I'll also be making an updated overall tier list during the 3.4 patch, so if any of those things interests you, then stick around. Alright, back to the vid. Will it? Will it, chat? Well, It might. Yeah, let's talk about Acheron. In all my days of watching and covering Star Rail league cycles, I don't think the collective insanity that Acheron mains have spread has ever or will ever be topped. But in all of that chaos, I guess is the word to use, it might be difficult to find a genuine answer of, well, how good is Cipher compared to Jiaoshu? To rip the band-aid off, let's go through a flowchart of different possible states that your account could be in. First, do you have an E0 Acheron and a Jiaoshu? If yes, well, then the comparison between the two doesn't even matter in the slightest. The question instead becomes, do you care that much about vertically investing in a 1-year-old unit to pull for Jiaoshu's best support partner? If yes, then Cipher is your best option by a wide margin. Using these two star-crossed mortal enemies together is the best way to keep Acheron competitive in today's meta, although I still wouldn't call Cipher needed. Acheron with Jiaoshu is, for now, still able to clear fast enough on non-Uber Shield content to where Cipher is more of an assurance of somewhat future relevancy, on top of shaving a couple of cycles right now, more than anything else. If you have an E0 Acheron without Jiaoshu, then the same overall recommendation still applies. If you care about making her strong, getting Jiaoshu and Cipher will be your best bet, but Cipher can still fill in Jiaoshu's role, if you just don't like the guy or something. Like with Feixiao when comparing Cipher to Topaz, it's a case of having higher damage amping but with lower stack generation. This is not completely binary, as Jiaoshu's stack generation is very dependent on how frequently the enemy moves, and Cipher's stack generation can be messed up by repeatedly applying pearls onto the same enemy, meaning that her signature might be necessary in lower enemy count fights to ensure consistent debuff application. Not using Jiaoshu also opens back up Trend on a preservation character, which can help rebalance things back in Cipher's favor. Essentially, while Jiaoshu on paper is more favored by pure fiction content, Cipher is at the very least even in most fights, if not slightly or very ahead, depending on how the fight works, for Cipher's ult shared damage and Jiaoshu stacks. And when both are at E0S1, Cipher wins straight up. For an E2 Acheron in the coveted single Hildy slot, Cipher is more clearly ahead, thanks to her potential stack generation problems being less of an issue, thanks to Acheron generating more for herself, and via having a Harmony unit to action advance her. So TLDR, if you have Jiaoshu, Cipher's good alongside him. If you want to replace Jiaoshu, or his would-be role if you don't have/want him, Cipher can do that, but this is weaker than using them together. And for E2, Cipher is best in slot. Another facet of Cipher that I think is important to her overall viability is the damage utility that comes from the rest of the team besides the carry. Cipher, Hyacine, and Tribbie are all in this genre of supports that have sizable personal damage on top of their normal buffing capabilities. Since Cipher's usefulness is tied to how much damage she can record, she scales better with partners who contribute damage as their utility. You can't buff Cipher's true damage with actual damage amping, but if her teammates are individually contributing to her true damage recording, then Cipher will become stronger as a result. I'm not exactly going to put Hyacine and Tribbie in this top tier, since they are more best in slot for each other than they are with her, but really a team of Hyacine, Tribbie, Cipher, and then any carry in the game can be a nice turn your brain off comp if optimizing your team building just really isn't something that you want to think too hard about. Let's next briefly touch on the newly introduced and buffed units that are coming in 3.4. With the always present, this is only the start of their pre-release cycle, so all of this can and will definitely change by the time they come out stamp, which the previously mentioned Silverwolf already has. Getting into it, for the newly relevant Dot, she's worse than Ranmei, but still very viable as an alternative. For Blade and Jingliu, they are of course more synergistic with Tribbie and Sunday as their primary supports, but Cipher is pretty close to the next best thing for replacing Tribbie. For Saber, she really doesn't do much for her since Cipher's ultimate is hard to justify spamming. For Phainon, Cipher is kinda weird, in that she is both really good and really not good for him. For the good parts, Phainon is incredibly saturated with standard damage buffs, both in his own kit and from his best teammates. So her 40% vulnerability, pearls usage, and 16 to 24% true damage is especially notable here. One of Phainon's current biggest weaknesses is how slow his clear speed becomes after exiting his ultimate, but Cipher can be a band-aid solution to this with her ultimate, giving you one last gigantic burst of damage to potentially end the fight before his drawbacks become a problem. For the downsides, well, she doesn't generate any stacks for him at all. I already wouldn't recommend her in the first place for a non-sustainless team, but even in a sustainless team, getting him into his ultimate quickly is pretty dang important. Also, since you can't cancel Phainon's ultimate without, like, dying intentionally, it's difficult to really control whether or not Cipher's ultimate will be able to be the last-minute clutch that you need it to be. If it's the first ult of the fight and you're in the second wave and the ult is brought over from the first wave with only a couple of turns, then yeah, in this very common scenario, she will be able to be clutch really consistently. But otherwise, this important role can be a bit shaky for her. Overall, I'm comfortable saying that she's not best in slot, but she does have some genuine merits for him. So she goes here. And for Archer, she's actually pretty good as a Silverwolf alternative, as her damage recording is most efficient in single target and and her being quantum helps with filling out Sparkle's attack buff condition. For the final unit in the top tier, let's look at Feixiao. Cipher, with Pearls, is able to apply a consistent 3 debuffs, thanks to, well, Pearls, her skill that applies an attack debuff, and her constant vulnerability debuff. So, by herself, she can guarantee Feixiao's 100% follow-ups from before Feixiao's first turn, and if that's what you need from her team slot, then she is best in slot. Like Feixiao, Cipher is most directly comparable to Topaz here, where she now doesn't have the requirement of either E1 or S1 to have the necessary amount of debuffs. Is investing in her a better idea for Feixiao than, like, an E1 Robin instead for the entire account? No, not really. Especially with the Silver Wolf-sized elephant in the room that we just talked about before. Look, in a vacuum, Feixiao does deserve to be in this top tier. In a non-uber premium team without your E1 Robins, S1 Topazes, or E1 Tribbies, Cipher is a marginal upgrade to Feixiao's best team. Is she worth going for him? Not in my opinion, but this list isn't a pull priority representation, so at the top he stays. And to round out the tier list, we have the break units in their own category, where her utility does work for them, but their wants from their supports are not met with raw damage alone. Someone like Firefly can appreciate her large break damage being stored and redistributed outside of her turns, but that utility doesn't hold a candle to weakness break efficiency, super break, or exo toughness. And in the tier below them, we have the units who are weak enough to the point that running Cipher as a main DPS would be better. Her numbers, even after her last round of nerfs, are still not half bad, and while I would not say at all that she works in that same level of pretty goodness as running Hyacine as a main DPS in Pure Fiction, it can still work, of course, if you put enough vertical investment into it. And with that, that's the list. Yeah, I don't think there's anyone in the bottom tier this time. In my opinion, there is not a single unit in the game right now that is actively bad with her, which I would count as a genuine strength of hers. Anyways, expect a full Cipher guide sometime soon-ish, and in that time, check out my live streams if you want to drop by and say hi. With that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye!